Thank you to the British Guild of Beer Writers for inviting me to come and talk to you this afternoon. I'm very honoured. There's some very esteemed people in the room, so yeah, thank you very much. I thought I'd just start by giving you a little bit of introduction to who I am. So my name's Emma Gilleland. As Ian said, I'm Director of Brewing for Marston's. So I've been in the industry for nearly 30 years now. So I've actually lived in this area longer than I haven't lived in this area. So I'm not from Burton, I'm actually from Kent, but I've lived in this area for 30 years. So I joined Marston, Thompson and Evershed back in 1992. I did a placement year there I was invited to a placement year by Paul Bailey, who was the head brewer at the time. And when I graduated in 1994, he asked me back to train as a brewer. So yeah, I joined in 1994 as a shift brewer, working for Paul Bailey. 1998, we had a takeover by Wolverhampton Dudley Breweries. And then we began a series of acquisitions. So the company changed to Wolverhampton Dudley Breweries. Several years later, W&DB saw the error of their ways and renamed the company Marston's PLC, which we enjoyed that name for a very long time. And then just 2 years ago, we formed a joint venture with Carlsberg Marston's. So I've been in Burton for 30 years. I've actually worked for 4 different businesses without moving. So I started off being in charge of 1 brewery, then 6, then 7, and today I'm now in charge of 4 breweries for Marston's. So that's a little bit about me. Just listening to some of the talks today and the heritage. Back in 2009, we celebrated 175 years of brewing at Marston's. So Marston's was established in 1834. And I can remember when I first came to Burton-on-Trent, it was dominated by Bass and Incoop at the time. They were massive breweries, and Marston, Thompson and Evershed was the smallest, one of the smallest breweries there. And I think the industry is absolutely incredible, and the changes that have happened. And I never would have thought back then that Marston's would have survived those 2 big breweries, and Marston's still here in the town, and I really look forward to hopefully to be here in 12 years' time when we celebrate our 200 years. So that's one of the goals in my career, to still be to survive until then. So yeah, Pete asked me to talk about why Burton, why and how Burton is a natural home of hoppy pale ales. I'm not going to go really technical because, water chemistry isn't a huge area of expertise for me, but, I will give you a good overview of why Burton. So Burton Water is known for brewing the best pale ales, and quantitatively, water is the biggest raw ingredient in beer. And, we're really lucky here in Burton. We literally have the finest brewing liquor under our doorstep. And as was spoken about earlier, this was, this sort of asset was discovered, back in the 12th century when the monks at St Modwen's Abbey were first started brewing. So what is so special about the water? It is the mineral content, it's the gypsum that's in the water that makes it so special. So it's rich in calcium sulfates, it's rich in the ions of calcium, magnesium and sulfate. And why is the water so rich in sulfate, in gypsum? So the water that we use in the brewery today is drawn from the wells and the boreholes that are sunk deep into the bedrocks below the town. And it's the geology of this area that makes the water what it is. So courtesy of our hydrologists, they've put some slides together for me. This sort of shows breweries, beer styles and different aquifers. And it's the different aquifers that make the different chemistry of the water that we have. So what this slide demonstrates is the different types of aquifers that we've got in the UK, and the effect that, and on the left-hand side, the effect that has on the chemistry of the water. So if we look at our area, the Triassic sandstone. So this is the big bit going down the middle.
Don't worry, it's been round for years.
So the water that comes from our area is very, very rich, as I said, in calcium sulfate and magnesium. And just by way of sort of like comparison, we can see on the chart on the left-hand side that typically the water from Burton, the calcium ions are up at sort of 350 milligrams per litre, in comparison to the water in other areas of the UK, which range from about, the low 40s to 150, so considerably higher in calcium. And what Burton is really known for is the level of sulfates. So typically the sulfates in Burton water is between 600 and 800 ppm, whereas in other areas of the UK, a lot lower. Could you go on to the next slide, please? So in terms of the water, the water flows. The water falls as rain around the surrounding hills of Burton, and that trickles through the bedrocks into, through the strata and collects. Sorry, completely lost where I am. I'm so sorry. Okay, yeah. So, beg your pardon. Okay, it's because I'm on the wrong slide. I'm sorry. Okay, so. Going back to this slide here. Sorry, so in terms of different aquifers, different chemistry, so we have here, I'm demonstrating water from different areas of the UK. So in London, as I said before, we've got in Burton, as I said before, the high calcium and the high sulfates. In Birmingham, lot lower calcium and sulfates, and if we think about sort of like areas like Wolverhampton, very high in chloride. Chloride gives a very sweet and sort of like mellow taste to the beer, so sort of Banks is mild. London, again, water very different, a lot lower in calcium, a lot lower in sulfates, very good for brewing the porters. Keighley, we've got some friends here from Keighley. We've got the Keighley water here, so again, low in calcium, low in all of the mineral content. And then we've got Marston, Blackburn, Wrexham. So, this sort of demonstrates the different levels of ions that are in the waters from different areas. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So this shows the Burton aquifer. As I said, the water is drawn from the wells and the borehole, which is sunk very deep into the bedrock below the town. The surrounding topography and geology of the extraction point influences the characteristics of the water abstracted. So as I said on the previous slide, certain water types in terms of their mineral composition and hardness are particularly suited to brewing. So in Burton, the wells are drilled into the bedrock, which is the Mercia mudstone, which is overlying the Sherwood sandstone. The gypsum, which is the calcium sulfate, occurs as very thin layers and nodules, and as the water falls on the hills surrounding Burton, it percolates slowly through the rock strata. And as it filters through the ground, it collects traces of gypsum. So these gypsum-rich aquifers give Burton water the perfect ionic balance for brewing pale ales. And what does that perfect ionic balance look like? High levels of sulfate and relatively high levels of calcium. So the sulfate to chloride ratio is very, very important. So a ratio of 2 to 1 or higher tend to make beers drier with a more assertive hop balance, as opposed to a lower ratio where your chlorides are higher than your sulfates, which tend to give a more fuller, sweeter beer. And what the sulfate and the calcium helps to do is really accentuate that hop bitterness, which leads to a drier, crisper finish of the Burton pale ales, which is very evident within pedigree. It also contributes to a slightly sulphurous aroma known as the Burton snatch. And again, that's what sort of Burton beers are very sort of well known for. There's also quite a significant amount of magnesium in the water in Burton, and this balances with the high calcium content. Calcium is important in brewing for lowering the pH. You know, the pH in wort of about 5 to 5.2 is absolutely ideal for brewing IPAs and pale ales. And the high calcium sulfate content also allows for the high hopping rates, and we've heard quite a lot about this earlier on today, which help give the beer stability, and therefore before pasteurisation, it made the beers less prone to going off and able to survive for long times and long journeys, hence the India IPA that we've heard quite a lot about today. Just as a little side note, sort of like over the years, you know, people have sort of said to me, you know, I really love pedigree, but it plays havoc with me the next day, really upsets my stomach. So that's sort of, you know, quite a common comment that I've heard from people, and just sort of like reading up a little bit about this. Sulfate from the magnesium sulfate can cause fluid retention. And so what this does, this causes an increase in volume in the intestine, which leads to an increase on pressure on the peristalsis. So that explains some of the reasons why some people sometimes have a pedigree stomach the next day. So in terms of Marstons, we still brew using our well water. We have 10 wells, we have 9 field wells and 1 borehole. And of these, 5 of the field wells are still active, as is the borehole. We're heavily licensed by the Environment Agency. We have an abstraction limit, and we have, you know, we have consent limits that we really have to abide to. And we can abstract up to 1,400 metre cubed a day, or just under 450,000 metre cubed a year. And this licence is reviewed periodically by the Environment Agency. The water is still used for brewing. Depending on what beers we're brewing, we will blend to different ratios, the different sources of the water from the field wells and the bore tube and the mains water. And we abstract up to our licence levels, and we use the water for cleaning as well, because obviously it's a more cost-effective source of water. We carry on using the well water today for brewing pedigree and Old Empire, and as has been discussed today, we brew Bass for ABI. So that's everything I wanted to talk about today. So thank you.